Somewhere in the murky shallows of Spring Lake Park, half submerged in marsh grass, an alto saxophone waited to be found. Not the night of the murder, not in the weeks of searching that followed. Months later, long after the headlines had moved on, after the ordinary churn of a post-war world trying to remember how to be normal again had swallowed the story whole. When it was finally recovered, the water had darkened the brass, and the marsh had done what marshes do to the things left in them. Someone had brought it there. Someone had walked through that park with a 15-year-old girl's instrument and put it in the water. And that someone, investigators would come to believe, was never charged, never stood before a jury, died in 1994 at 77 years old. In the ordinary way, people die not in a courtroom, not in a cell, not in any of the places justice is supposed to catch up with a person. Just gone, leaving the water and the marsh grass and a question with no bottom. Her name was Betty Jo Booker. Before she is anything else in this story, before she is a victim, before she is a case number, she is a person who deserves to be seen clearly. 15 years old, possibly 16 by the time April came in, 1946. An A student at Texarkana High School, the kind of student whose grades suggest not just intelligence but a specific quality of attention, the willingness to sit still with something and master it. And she played the alto saxophone. Not casually, not the way some teenagers pick up an instrument and set it down after a few months. Well enough to earn a chair in a working band. Jerry Atkins and the Rhythmaires were not a school ensemble. They were a band that played gigs, that stood on stages in front of audiences and got paid. Betty Jo was their alto player. At 15, the alto saxophone sits in the middle register of its family, not the soprano's bright edge, not the tenor's deep resonance, but a voice in between, warm and articulate, capable of both melody and the harmonic field that holds a band together. It takes time to develop a sound worth listening to. It takes the particular stubbornness of a young person who has decided that something matters and is willing to put in the hours to prove it. Betty Jo had done that work. Her talent was visible enough that adults in a working music community recognized it and gave her a seat at the table. That is who she was. Saturday, the 13th of April, 1946, was Easter weekend. The Rhythmaires had a gig at the VFW building, one of the social anchors of post-war American community life, the kind of place that filled up on a Saturday night with people who needed, badly, to do something ordinary and pleasant. Betty Jo played her set. After the show, somewhere around 1 in the morning, she met up with Paul Martin, 15 or 16, a friend rather than a boyfriend, another teenager out late on a holiday weekend. A witness placed them together at a restaurant near Spring Lake Park at approximately 1 a.m. They drove into the park after that. At 6:30 the following morning, a family out for an early Easter Sunday drive found Paul Martin's body on the northern edge of North Park Road. He had been shot 4 times. Betty Jo was found separately nearly a mile away, in a wooded area. Her saxophone case was near the car. The instrument itself was gone. Someone took it. Not the car, not a wallet, not anything thieves ordinarily take. An alto saxophone. The thing she had worked for, earned a professional chair with, the object most specifically and personally hers on the night she died. Months later, it reappeared in the marsh, a few hundred yards from where her body had been found, left there, thrown there, or placed with whatever deliberateness the mind behind it was capable of. The man investigators came to believe was responsible was named Ewell Lee Swinney. He was arrested in Dallas in late June 1946, not for murder, for car theft. The full machinery of what followed, the confession that wasn't, and the testimony that vanished, and the legal walls that went up and never came down, belongs to the chapters ahead. What matters here is the final fact. Swinney died on the 15th of September, 1994. He was never charged, never tried, never forced to account for what happened to Betty Jo Booker, Paul Martin, Richard Griffin, Polly Ann Moore, or Virgil Starks on those nights in the spring of 1946. The case was not dismissed and not resolved. It remains, to this day, the oldest, active, unsolved murder investigation in Texas Ranger history. The Rangers are an institution that dates to 1823. Their oldest open murder file belongs to a 15-year-old alto saxophonist from Texarkana. The detectives who worked the case are dead. Captain M.T. Gonzalez, who led the investigation with pearl-handled revolvers and a chain-smoker's certainty, died in 1977. The victim's youngest surviving relatives are in their 80s. The window of living memory is not merely closing, it has nearly shut. What remains is the file. And the question the file refuses to answer. This is not, at its core, a story about a monster. Monsters are a way of explaining away what is genuinely frightening about these events. That the person investigators believed was responsible was not a figure of gothic horror, but an ordinary criminal, a car thief and burglar from Texas, whose violence, if it was his violence, came from somewhere recognizably human, and therefore more disturbing than any mythology. The real horror here is not the killer. It is the gap between what the evidence suggested and what the law could do with it. A system that arrived at the edge of an answer and could not, for reasons structural and institutional and procedural, cross that final distance. That fracture, and what it cost, is what every chapter of this story is about. There is a photograph that used to appear in Texarkana civic guides, a novelty shot. The kind of image that tourist bureaus commission when their town has an unusual feature worth promoting. A man stands on a sidewalk with 1 foot in Texas and 1 foot in Arkansas, grinning as though the very ground beneath him is a joke the rest of the country hasn't heard yet. The street behind him is called State Line Avenue. The white line painted across the asphalt is not decorative. It is the border of 2 sovereign states, running straight through the middle of a city of 30 to 35,000 people who went to the same churches, shopped at the same markets, and breathed the same air, without ever being entirely sure which state was claiming them on a given afternoon. Texarkana in 1946 was not a small town. A functioning mid-sized southern city, a rail hub with lines running east toward Little Rock and west toward Dallas, a regional economic center whose working population was employed at the Red River Arsenal, a federal installation that had spent 4 years manufacturing ammunition and war materiel, and was now transitioning that industrial capacity into peacetime production. Hotels, newspapers, department stores, schools, churches of every denomination the American South could produce. A place where people had careers and mortgages and sent their children to school and bought groceries on Saturday afternoons. The city's post office solved the jurisdictional identity problem with characteristic American pragmatism. Both the Texas and Arkansas sides used the same address, not Texarkana, Texas, or Texarkana, Arkansas, but simply Texarkana, as though the state line were a bureaucratic detail too minor to bother with. In some essential sense, they were one place. But State Line Avenue was more than a novelty. It was a constitutional seam. Stand on the Texas side and you are in the jurisdiction of the Texarkana, Texas Police Department, operating under Texas law, answerable to Bowie County. Take 9 steps east across that white line, and you are in the jurisdiction of the Texarkana, Arkansas Police Department, answerable to Miller County. 4 separate agencies, 4 separate sets of statutes, procedures, and evidentiary standards, and critically, 4 separate sets of institutional priorities, professional rivalries, and competing claims to authority. No mechanism for unified command existed. The border was an attraction, a curiosity, a place where people took photographs. It had never been stress-tested. Consider what this arrangement meant for any serious crime that a mobile offender could exploit. A crime committed on the Texas side involved the Texarkana, Texas Police Department and the Bowie County Sheriff's Office. A crime on the Arkansas side involved the Texarkana, Arkansas Police Department and Miller County. A crime that moved across the line involved all 4, with no treaty, No protocol, no shared command structure. Evidence collected in Texas was processed under Texas procedure. Evidence collected in Arkansas under Arkansas procedure. Witnesses interviewed by one department might never be known to another. A suspect crossing the line could not, without extradition process, be held for a crime committed on the other side. The machinery of justice in Texarkana had been designed for a jurisdiction. It had not been designed for a border. The community into which these conditions were embedded was a post-war southern city in the specific and complicated spring of 1946. The United States had demobilized with extraordinary speed following the Japanese surrender in August 1945. By early 1946, hundreds of thousands of veterans were flowing back into American communities, trained, in many cases profoundly altered, returning to a civilian world that had been running for 4 years without them. Texarkana received its share. Men who had spent years reading threats, operating under extreme stress, responding to danger with disciplined force. Post-traumatic stress disorder did not exist as a clinical category in 1946. Men who had been under fire in the Pacific or Europe came home and were expected to resume their civilian identities within months. Rationing was only beginning to end. There was money coming back into circulation, jobs at the arsenal, a genuine economic energy, and alongside it, the specific anxiety of a community reassembling itself and wondering whether the ordinary pleasures of pre-war life were truly recoverable. Couples went to the movies on Saturday nights. Young people danced at the VFW. Those things were happening in Texarkana in the spring of 1946, partly because the community needed them to happen, needed the confirmation that ordinary life was available again. Into that texture, add race. Texarkana, in 1946, was a legally segregated southern city. The separation between black and white Texarkana was not informal or customary. It was enforced by law, by municipal ordinance, by the formal apparatus of Jim Crow. Schools were separate. Neighborhoods were separate. Public accommodations were separate. The police departments on both sides were staffed and commanded by white men operating within the legal and cultural assumptions of 1946 Southern law enforcement. That is not an accusation against individuals. It is a description of the institutional environment. This matters for what follows in ways that take time to become fully visible. The racial structure of Texarkana determined whose testimony was taken seriously and whose was challenged, which neighborhoods were surveilled, and which were interviewed as potential witnesses. When the attacks began, when a killer moved through this city with apparent ease, exploiting its social patterns and territorial complexity, the institutions responding to that movement carried the full weight of their era's assumptions with them. Before a single shot was fired on a gravel road off Highway 67 inches, February 1946, the geography, the law, and the institutional culture of Texarkana had arranged themselves into a specific configuration, not designed with malice. The product of ordinary processes by which American communities organized themselves. The drawing of municipal boundaries, the creation of county offices, the application of state law, police departments with overlapping territorial mandates and no protocol governing their overlap. Nobody planned for a serial killer. Nobody planned for a border to be weaponized. The machinery of 2 state governments and 4 law enforcement agencies was simply doing what it had always done, operating within its own limits, according to its own rules, for its own purposes. What happened in the spring of 1946 was that those ordinary conditions met an extraordinary event, and what had never been stress-tested revealed, under pressure, exactly how it was built. The road had no official name. It was a gravel spur off Highway 67 inches, Bowie County, Texas. The kind of lane that develops an informal identity through use, through accumulated knowledge shared among young people in a mid-sized southern city who needed somewhere to go on Saturday nights after the movie let out. By February 1946, it was understood. You knew where it was, or you didn't. On the night of Saturday, the 22nd of February 1946, Jimmy Hollis parked there sometime after 11:30. He was 24 or 25. Mary Jeannie Larry, beside him, was 19. They had spent the earlier part of the evening on a double date, the movies, the kind of uncomplicated Saturday that required no elaboration. Films were playing in downtown Texarkana that winter, the theaters full of people resuming peacetime's ordinary pleasures, and afterward couples had somewhere to go. Outside, February in northeast Texas is cold enough to make the cab of a parked car feel private and warm. The windows would have fogged within minutes. What existed beyond the glass was another world entirely. Jimmy heard it first, or possibly Mary did. What both described, separately and consistently, was this: footsteps, gravel underfoot, the specific sound of weight on loose stone, the slow, deliberate crunch of someone approaching without urgency. Not running, not sneaking, walking. Then a light bright and direct through the driver's window, a flashlight beam cutting through the condensation and landing on Jimmy's face. Jimmy lowered the window. The man standing outside held the flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. Over his head he wore a white sack fabric pulled down past his chin, 2 holes cut for the eyes, a third smaller opening for the mouth. His voice, by both accounts, was calm, unhurried. He spoke as though he had all night. He ordered them out of the car. They complied. Then he pistol-whipped Jimmy Hollis using the gun as a bludgeon, delivering blows that fractured his skull. While Jimmy was incapacitated on the gravel, the attacker turned to Mary Larry. He attempted a sexual assault. She fought. She ran toward the highway. He shot her in the back. Jimmy, attempting to recover, was shot in the shoulder. Then the man walked away. Footsteps on gravel, the same deliberate crunch that had announced his arrival now marking his departure. Then, at some distance, a car engine turning over in the dark. Not a panicked ignition, just an engine starting, and then the sound diminishing as the car moved away. Both Jimmy and Mary survived. The description Mary Larry gave was specific enough to be useful and fragmentary enough to be maddening. Roughly 6 feet tall, khaki work pants, a dark jacket, a calm voice without a pronounced accent. She told police she believed her attacker was a black man, a belief she qualified immediately and honestly because the mask had prevented her from seeing his face. Whether she had registered something in his voice, in skin visible where a jacket sleeve might gap, some other perceptual detail processed under mortal stress, she did not specify. What she said was that it was her genuine impression. Some law enforcement personnel reportedly challenged her account. The nature of that challenge, and whether it reflected racial bias or genuine investigative skepticism, is not fully documented. What is documented is that the challenge occurred. Jimmy Hollis's contribution was more limited. The fractured skull had done what fractured skulls do to memory, not erased it cleanly, but distorted it, leaving gaps where sequence should have been continuous. Trauma does this with particular viciousness. It preserves sensory fragments and obscures connective tissue. He could recall the flashlight, the bag, the quality of the voice. He could not reconstruct, with the reliability an investigation requires, the complete order of what he saw. These two people, a young man with a fractured skull and incomplete recollection, and a 19-year-old woman who had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and shot, whose identification of her attacker was almost immediately challenged, were the sum total of the evidentiary foundation for every theory the investigation would ever produce. Every subsequent sketch, every profile, every suspect identified traced backward through what Mary Larry could recall from behind the shock of having a bullet pass through her body on a gravel road outside Texarkana. The white sack with crude eye holes is the phantom's most recognizable attribute, the image that appeared in the newspaper. that would eventually appear in a film that became the icon of the case. It is also the attribute that appears only here, only in this first attack, corroborated by no subsequent surviving witness. 3 people survived across the 4 attacks: Hollis, Larry, and Katie Starks. And Starks never saw her attacker at all. Whether the iconic image matches what Mary Larry actually saw through flashlight glare on a February night in 1946 is a question the record cannot definitively close. It matters because if the first attack is incorrectly linked to the subsequent murders, if February 22 was a separate perpetrator using the same road and targeting the same demographic, then the entire serial narrative shifts on its axis. No evidence has established that the February 22 attacker was definitively the same person who killed Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore 30 days later. The ballistics from the first attack, where the weapon was used primarily as a bludgeon, require careful reading alongside those from the second, where the killer fired through glass from a distance without ever approaching the window. 2 incidents, same highway corridor, same victim profile. Whether they share a perpetrator is a question the evidence has not answered with finality. What it has answered is simpler and more permanent. Every theory of this case rests on what Mary Larry saw through a flashlight beam, masked in the dark, before she was shot. 30 days. Not 31, not 28. Exactly 30 days after Jimmy Hollis was pulled from his car on a gravel spur off Highway 67, a passing motorist, on the morning of Sunday, the 24th of March, 1946, noticed a vehicle sitting at the edge of a secluded road near Spring Lake Park on the Texas side of Texarkana. The car was parked the way parked cars are, parked on lanes like that, pulled off, partially obscured, positioned away from the road. Nothing about its presence was unusual. What was unusual was that it hadn't moved. Inside were Richard L. Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, both dead. Richard Griffin was 29 years old. He worked at the Red River Arsenal, steady federal employment, in a region where that meant something. He had a family. He had co-workers who learned what happened to him on a Sunday morning when the news moved through town by telephone and word of mouth, the terrible chain of someone telling someone who knew someone who had to sit down when they heard it. Polly Ann Moore was 17. Neighbors described her as sweet-natured, the kind of description offered by people who knew someone well enough to love them and are now trying to give the truest possible summary of who that person was in the world. They deserve those sentences. The investigation that follows will treat them primarily as evidence, and there is no alternative evidence as how a murder gets solved. But Griffin and Moore were not abstractions in a crime timeline. They were people who drove somewhere together on a Saturday night and did not come home. The killer did not walk to the car window this time. He positioned himself outside the vehicle and fired through the glass. Shell casings on the ground outside. The windows shattered inward. At least one victim had been moving when hit shot while attempting to flee, then dragged back inside. The killer, after shooting through the glass, after his victim's attempted escape, had returned to the car and repositioned a body. Whether this was deliberate concealment or something more psychologically opaque, it was behavior with intention behind it. He was not finished when the shooting stopped. He stayed. The .32 caliber casings left a ballistic signature that investigators compared against what they had from the February 22 attack. The same caliber. The ballistics, within the limitations of 1,946 methodology, were consistent with the same weapon. This was the first hard evidentiary thread. Not a theory, not a pattern inferred from resemblance, a physical linkage between 2 separate incidents involving 2 separate sets of victims on the same highway corridor. 1 killer, 2 attacks, 30 days apart. The distinction in method between the 2 incidents is worth sitting with because it complicates the simple narrative of a consistent perpetrator. On February 22, The attacker approached on foot, knocked or shone his light, spoke to the occupants, ordered them out, and committed his violence in direct physical contact. He was close enough for victims to see the bag on his head, close enough to hear his voice at conversational distance. On March 24, there was none of that. No approach to the window, no conversation. The killer stood at a remove and fired through the glass, giving his victims no chance to see him, speak to him, or survive. Whether this reflects deliberate tactical evolution having left two living witnesses or a different level of intent from the beginning, the record does not allow a definitive answer. What it allows is the observation that two attacks share a weapon, a location type, a victim demographic, and a timing pattern, while differing substantially in execution. The Texarkana Gazette named him. The label arrived in print sometime in the weeks following the March 24 murders, the Phantom Killer, and it did what names do in situations like this. It transformed a series of disconnected violent incidents into a single entity, an implied author. And once a community understands there is an intentional human agent behind the events, not random violence, not accident, but a person making decisions and returning to the same ground, the entire frame of the threat shifts. Random violence is terrifying because it cannot be anticipated. Purposeful violence by a named, patterned entity is terrifying in a different register. It can be anticipated, and that anticipation is its own kind of suffering. Texarkana read the paper and understood that the phantom had a pattern. Understanding the pattern did not make anyone safer. It made everyone afraid in a way they could articulate. The Rhythmares finished their set somewhere after midnight. That is the last verifiable, ordinary fact of Betty Jo Booker's life, that she had played through a full evening's worth of music at the VFW building, that the gig had run its course the way Saturday night gigs do, and that when the instruments were packed and the crowd thinned and the building emptied into the spring dark of Easter Saturday, she was a 15-year-old girl who had just done what she was good at. She had performed. She had been present in the world and the way musicians are present, their skill moving through a room and into other people's ears, leaving something behind. Paul Martin met her at a restaurant near Spring Lake Park at approximately 1 a.m. A witness placed them there together. Two kids, late on the most communal weekend of the Southern Christian calendar, in the particular loose freedom that holidays sometimes open up the permission to be out past the usual hour. The sense that ordinary rules don't fully apply on a night when the whole community is gathered. Churches would fill in the morning. Families would sit down to Easter dinner. The town would perform the rituals of resurrection and renewal. Paul and Betty Jo drove into the park. At 6:30 a.m., a family out for an early Easter Sunday drive found Paul Martin lying on his left side along the northern edge of North Park Road, shot 4 times. The family would have had no frame for what they were seeing at first. A boy lying on the road's edge, then closer, then the irreversible comprehension. Paul Martin's car was found parked outside the entrance to Spring Lake Park, 3 miles north of where his body lay. The doors were open. The keys were still in the ignition. The car had not stalled or been abandoned in panic. It had been driven there deliberately after the murders. Someone had gotten into Paul Martin's car with keys he'd had in his possession when he drove into the park and moved the vehicle 3 miles before walking away. Moving a victim's car 3 miles from the murder scene after killing 2 teenagers is a considered act. It requires composure and deliberateness of a particular and disturbing kind. The blood evidence told his own story. Paul was not shot where his body was found. He was shot closer to the car and moved. Whether he tried to run and was shot down at a distance, or was shot at the car and then repositioned, the physical evidence supports movement after the initial shooting, but not which version occurred. What it rules out is a scenario in which he was shot once, where he lay and left immediately. He was shot 4 times. He was moved. Both things required the killer to remain present long enough to accomplish them. Betty Jo Booker was found nearly a mile from Paul's body, in a wooded area. A mile. Between where Paul Martin lay on the road's edge and where Betty Jo was found in the trees, there is a distance that represents the most disturbing inference in the entire case against the Phantom. The killer dealt with each of them separately. He did not shoot them simultaneously at the same location, the way the Griffin Moore attack had unfolded. He separated them, or killed one, and then moved to the other, in a sequence that the physical evidence records but cannot narrate. Betty Jo was shot twice, once in the neck, once in the torso. She was found nearly a mile from her friend in the dark of a wooded park, which means that at some point in the sequence of that night's violence, she was alone with whoever was doing this. That is the fact the record preserves. Her saxophone case was near the car. The instrument was not in it. The alto saxophone that Betty Jo Booker had played at the VFW building a few hours earlier carried through the evening, traveled with her to the restaurant, presumably in the car when she and Paul drove into the park, was gone. Months later, it was recovered from a marsh in Spring Lake Park, half submerged, the same park, the same location where her body had been found, close enough to the original site that its eventual recovery felt like a return. The ballistics closed the evidentiary triangle. The same .32 caliber pistol, consistent with the weapon from February 22, confirmed as the weapon from March 24, had fired the shots that killed Paul Martin and Betty Jo Booker. 3 attacks, the same weapon, each time. 3 separate crime scenes, all within the same geographic corridor, all within 10 weeks, all ballistically linked to the same gun. By the morning of Easter Sunday, the 14th of April, 1946, no one who examined that chain seriously could maintain that the Texarkana cases were unconnected. Couples, always parked in or near the same stretch of road and parkland on the Texas side, always on weekend nights, in the hours past midnight, always the same weapon. And in the third attack, for the first time, both victims were teenagers, 15 or 16 years old, the same age range that would, in later decades, become the statistical center of gravity for serial predatory violence in America. They were not adults who had wandered into some adult world danger. They were 15. They had been out late on a holiday. They drove into a park where teenagers drove on Saturday nights. The morning Texarkana woke to find Paul Martin dead and Betty Jo Booker missing, her body not yet found, was the morning the churches were full. The cultural collision is not incidental to the record. It is part of how the third attack landed in the community's consciousness, not just as confirmation of a pattern, but as a desecration timed against the most communal moment of the calendar. 3 attacks, 5 victims, 1 weapon, 1 corridor of highway and parkland, 1 recurring window of time, and an alto saxophone lying somewhere in the water of a park marsh, in the dark, months away from being found. The town was not yet finished being afraid. It had barely started. The Texarkana Gazette did not invent the fear. It named it. There is a difference, and the difference matters. What the paper gave Texarkana was not terror, but taxonomy, a single, unified point of reference around which a community's anxiety could crystallize into something coherent and therefore, in a terrible way, more manageable, because a thing with a name is a thing that can at least be discussed, tracked, anticipated. Once a community understands there is an intentional author behind the events, the entire frame shifts. Random violence cannot be anticipated or avoided. Purposeful violence by a named, patterned entity generates a different register of dread, the foreknowledge that it is coming, and that foreknowledge is its own form of suffering. The Gazette gave that foreknowledge a noun, the Phantom Killer. It arrived in print, and it stayed. Within days of each attack, the hardware stores emptied. Literally, locks, chains, door bolts, padlocks, and ammunition boxes of it, whatever caliber the customer's firearm required, cleared from display cases as fast as shop owners could restock them. This is a verifiable consumer behavior pattern, the kind of data point that tells you what a population has concluded about its situation more precisely than any editorial or official statement. People bought locks because they believed the barrier between themselves and the phantom was inadequate. They bought ammunition because they intended to use it. Loaded guns appeared on nightstands. Furniture was pushed against doors. Windows that had been left open through mild Texas spring evenings were latched shut and checked again before anyone lay down. The domestic routines of an American household in 1946, dinner, radio, bed, were interrupted and reorganized around a single central question: is this house defensible? Outside those houses, the streets acquired their own new population. Shopkeepers stood outside their closed businesses through the evening hours. Farmers came into town after dark carrying rifles. Men in clusters of 2 and 3 walked the gravel roads on the city's outskirts, not walking, exactly, but covering ground, attending to sound and movement and the particular quality of darkness. No command structure, no assigned sectors, no radio communication, something more instinctive, a community's reflexive assertion that it would not yield the night. A significant number of those men had been trained by the United States Army to do precisely this. They had spent years learning to identify threats in darkness, to move through hostile terrain, to locate an enemy who did not wish to be found in European forests, Pacific islands, North African desert. Some had been combat infantry, men for whom hunting a hidden enemy in low visibility conditions was not abstract. They had practiced it. They had survived it. And now, in the spring of 1946, the same skill set was required on the gravel roads outside a Texas border town. They never caught him. They never even glimpsed him. The phantom moved through an armed, vigilant, combat-experienced population without leaving a single confirmed witness during the entire span of his active period. He operated on weekend nights, on roads these men were specifically patrolling. He killed twice after the patrols began. He moved a car 3 miles from a crime scene without being observed. He separated 2 victims in a park and dealt with each individually and walked away unseen. The readiness that combat had installed in these men was calibrated for a different kind of threat. Foreign enemies with visible formations, command structures, the logic of armies. The phantom had none of that. He was, as far as the evidence established, a single person who moved alone through the dark on specific nights and was gone before any response could be assembled. The social infrastructure of Texarkana contracted sharply. Diners that had served late customers closed early, then at sunset, then closed because there were no customers. Movie theaters went dark in the evenings first by reduced attendance, eventually by the self-defeating logic of public gathering. Going to the movies meant being on the street after dark, which was precisely what Texarkana had collectively decided it would not do. Front porch is the social infrastructure of mid-century Southern life, where neighbors spoke to each other, where the evening was negotiated, where community was performed across small distances between houses were abandoned. The front porch requires an inhabited street. The streets were empty. A city of 30 to 35,000 people, and nobody outside after sunset. Women of means packed their children and left, and that sentence contains a class structure worth examining. The ability to leave required a car, money, relatives with houses large enough to receive a sudden household, employment flexible enough to survive an extended absence. Working-class families, in which both the man's income and the woman's presence were economic necessities that could not be suspended, did not have that option. They stayed. They bolted their doors and stayed, because leaving was not something they could do. Fear, in 1946. Texarkana was shaped by the same economic gradients that shaped everything else. And then came May 3. Virgil Starks was 37 years old. He had come home from work, sat down in his living room armchair, and opened the evening newspaper. Not parked on a dark road, not out after midnight. Not young, Not a teenager, not part of any demographic pattern the previous 3 attacks had established. He was a middle-aged man in his own house, doing what his neighbors were doing, what millions of Americans did every evening in the years just after the war. He was home. That, it turned out, was no longer enough. The 3rd of May, 1946, was a new moon, the darkest possible night on the calendar. Whatever rules had governed the Phantom's previous attack patterns, this night breaks them at the most elementary level before it breaks them in any other way. A bullet came through the front window. Virgil Starks was struck twice, once in the head, once in the chest. He died instantly in his armchair, the newspaper still in his hands. The killer had positioned himself in the unlighted yard of a private residence on a moonless Friday night and fired through the glass. The light that made Virgil's home feel safe, the ordinary domestic light of a lived-in house, was the exact condition that made him a target. He was backlit. He was stationary. He had no idea the window between him and the dark was not protection. Katie Starks, 36, heard the shots from another room. She ran in and found her husband slumped in the chair. Then she heard footsteps. And then the detail that lodges and will not let go, a knock at the front door. Not another shot, a knock, deliberate, measured, as if someone expected it to be answered. Katie did not open the door. 3 more shots came through it. One struck her in the shoulder. She ran through the back door and out into the dark, across whatever ground separated the Starks farmhouse from the nearest neighbor, wounded and running until she reached help. She never saw the killer's face. What she gave investigators was built entirely from sound. Shots, footsteps, a knock, shots again, and then the silence she was already too far away to hear resolve. That knock deserves specific attention. In 3 previous attacks, the Phantom had used force or threat of force as his primary instrument of control. The knock at the Starks' front door is a different gesture entirely, almost conversational, implying a willingness to shift tactics mid-attack, to try something other than direct violence when the situation had changed. Whether that speaks to calculation or something more unsettling about his psychology, the evidence cannot resolve. Now count what this attack is not. Not a lover's lane, not a weekend. May 3 was a Friday, a significant deviation from 3 consecutive Saturday night attacks. Not teenagers, not a couple, in a vulnerable outdoor setting. The Starkses were married, middle-aged, at home, on a weeknight, inside a private residence. Every parameter of the established pattern is either absent or inverted. The ballistic record provides the thinnest thread of continuity. The weapon used against the Starkses was a .32 caliber pistol, the same caliber confirmed in all 3 prior attacks. That thread is real, but the research is honest about what 1,946 ballistic science could establish. The comparison methodology of the era was cruder, the analytical standards less formalized, and the .32 caliber pistol was among the most common handguns in civilian circulation in America. Matching caliber is not the same as matching weapon, so the question must be held openly. Was the 4th attack the work of the same person? 2 coherent possibilities. The Phantom escalated, changing his victim selection, his timing, his operational logic, after the armed patrols made the Highway 67 corridor more dangerous. Serial offenders do sometimes adapt when external pressure changes the conditions under which they can operate. Or someone else killed Virgil Starks, a different person, with the most common caliber of handgun in America, for reasons unconnected to the 3 prior attacks, folded into the Phantom narrative by investigators primed to see the series continuing, under enormous pressure to close a case that had paralyzed a city. Pattern recognition is a human cognitive imperative, and in 1946, without behavioral science or modern forensic protocols, a .32 caliber gun killing someone in Texarkana in May said, Phantom. That frame was understandable. It was possibly correct. No one living can say with certainty which possibility is true. What can be said is what the Starks attack did to the town. 3 prior incidents had given Texarkana a category of risk it could in theory manage. If you were young, if it was Saturday night, if you drove to a lover's lane on Highway 67, you were in danger. That geography had a location and a demographic profile. You could tell your children not to go to Spring Lake Park after dark. You could stay home. Virgil Starks stayed home. The curfew that followed was the government's formal acknowledgement of what that bullet proved. Not that the lovers' lanes were dangerous, but that the dark outside any window could contain a person with a gun and an intention. The armed men on the gravel roads had been guarding a perimeter that May 3 revealed to be imaginary. The fear that followed the Starks attack was qualitatively different from what had come before. It was not the fear of a particular place or a particular time. It was the fear that arrives when the category of safe no longer has a reliable address. Captain M.T. Lone Wolf Gonzalez of the Texas Rangers was not a subtle man. He was the kind of lawman the era produced and mythology preserved, a chain smoker with pearl-handled revolvers on both hips, a theatrical bearing, a record of solved cases that had defeated the agencies around him, and a nickname that announced its own paradox to anyone paying attention: Lone Wolf. In 1946, the Texas Rangers sent their most celebrated individual operator to solve a crime that required, above almost anything else, collective institutional coordination. The irony was structural before he unpacked a single bag. Gonzalez was 61 years old when he arrived in Texarkana. Methodical, a man who had seen the worst of what people did to each other in the Texas borderlands. He had presumably never encountered a case that rattled the entire community around him before he could rattle it himself. What he found when he arrived was not a single failing agency but 4. The investigative architecture reads, on paper, like a model of jurisdictional coverage: 2 municipal police departments, Texas and Arkansas, plus 2 county sheriff's offices, supplemented by the Texas Rangers and eventually the FBI. 6 agencies in varying degrees of active involvement. The manpower was substantial. The political will was evident. By every surface measurement, the investigative response was commensurate with the crime. The problem was not quantity. The 2 municipal police departments reportedly refused to share information with each other. Not an editorial characterization from a later era documented operational reality noted by investigators and journalists at the time. The Texas side and the Arkansas side conducted parallel investigations that intersected primarily through friction. Each competed for credit that, in the event, neither would ever be in a position to claim. The specific damage is worth tracing carefully. Crime scenes on the Texas side were processed under Texas protocols. Crime scenes on the Arkansas side under Arkansas protocols. Evidence held in separate rooms, with separate chains of custody, by agencies with separate evidentiary standards, and active institutional hostility between them. 2 agencies examining a ballistic connection between crimes each treated as primarily their own, with no mandatory evidence sharing, were not really comparing evidence. They were comparing conclusions about evidence neither had seen whole. Gonzalez's authority was, in the formal legal sense, absolute on the Texas side of State Line Avenue. The moment any lead crossed into Arkansas, that authority evaporated. He could follow a suspect across State Line Avenue. He could not compel a witness, execute a search, or conduct an interrogation in Miller County with the legal weight that backed him in Bowie County. The Rangers had been brought in to impose a command structure above competing Texas agencies. But the state they served ended at the midpoint of a 2-lane avenue, and the state on the other side had its own entirely legitimate authority to tell the Texas Rangers to stay on their side. This is not a technical footnote. The Phantom's attacks moved between Texas and Arkansas with an ease that suggested the state line was irrelevant to his planning, which it was, because he was not bound by it. The investigators chasing him were The geographic corridor he used sat almost perfectly on the jurisdictional seam. A person planning to operate where law enforcement coordination was structurally compromised could have found no more advantageous real estate in Texarkana than the ground within walking distance of State Line Avenue. The FBI's arrival added federal authority but not federal unity. The Bureau transcended the state line problem in theory. In practice, its involvement added another institutional voice to a conversation that already had too many its own reporting chains running back to Washington rather than to the Texarkana police chiefs, its own information-holding instincts. The two police departments did not become cooperative because the FBI had arrived. They became, if anything, more territorial, each angling for the jurisdictional relationship with federal agents that would give them the most investigative leverage. The volume of actual investigative activity was genuinely enormous. Dozens of suspects investigated and released. Hundreds of interviews conducted across the Texarkana area residents near the attack sites. Men matching Mary Larry's general physical description, known regional criminals, anyone whose alibi for the attack dates couldn't be immediately established. Tips from citizens generated at a volume that became its own management problem. Every phone call had to be assessed. Every accusation traced. Every alibi checked. The investigation was not lazy. It was not negligent. It was not passive. It was fractured along a line that ran straight through the middle of the city it was supposed to protect. Systemic failure looks different from individual failure. When one person fails, there is an account to settle, a judgment to render. When a system fails, the failure distributes itself across institutions and laws and historical circumstances that predate any individual decision, the Texas state line, competing sheriff's jurisdictions, evidence-sharing protocols that didn't exist, a command hierarchy that no single agency could impose. Nobody ordered the Texarkana police departments to feud. Nobody designed the jurisdictional architecture to benefit a serial killer. The machinery performed exactly as fractured machinery does. It moved, it generated heat, it consumed enormous human effort and institutional resource, and the case slipped through the gap between the moving parts. Gonzalez reportedly said, at some point during the investigation, words to the effect of, "We had a suspect, we had a confession, and we had nothing." A career lawman's precise summary of a situation he had likely never encountered before and would never encounter again. Not a failure of detection. A failure of conversion, the gap between what investigators believed and what the law allowed them to prove. That gap was not created by the phantom killer. It was waiting for him when he arrived. The attack stopped on the 28th of June, 1946. Not gradually. Not after a final incident suggesting exhaustion or flight. They simply stopped cleanly, completely, permanently on the day a man named Yule Lee Swinney was arrested in Dallas for stealing automobiles. He was not arrested for murder. He was not the subject of a coordinated manhunt that finally closed in on the right man. He was arrested for car theft, the crime he had committed so many times across so many years that it functioned less like a choice and more like a compulsion, the gravitational center of his criminal life. The most ordinary arrest imaginable. And it opened the most consequential evidentiary door in the entire investigation. Swinney was born the 9th of February, 1917, which made him 29 years old in the spring and summer of 1946. His criminal record documented a man who stole cars, broke into buildings, passed counterfeit currency, a rotating catalog of property crimes that kept him cycling through jails and courtrooms without ever producing a conviction serious enough to keep him incarcerated long. Acquisitive, mobile, opportunistic, oriented toward taking things that belong to other people, burglars and car thieves are not, as a statistical matter, the same population as serial killers. Every investigator who later wrestled with the Swinney question had to reckon with this gap, the distance between the man his record described and the crimes the phantom committed. But the record is only what gets documented. And what Dallas investigators found when they processed Yule Swinney on the 28th of June 1946 added an immediate and troubling dimension. He was carrying a .32 caliber pistol. Peggy Swinney was arrested alongside her husband. She was driving a car stolen from the murder scene of Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, the second attack, the first double homicide. Not a similar car. That car. The vehicle linked to the location where two people had been shot through their windows, where shell casings had been found on the ground outside, where blood had been found near the door where one of them had tried to flee and been dragged back. That vehicle was, on the morning of the 28th of June 1946, in Peggy Swinney's possession in Dallas. This is not a circumstantial detail. Circumstantial evidence requires an inference. What investigators had when they traced that vehicle was a direct physical connection between the Swinneys and a specific crime scene. The car was at the murder scene in March. The car was with Peggy Swinney in June. That is a chain of custody question, not a theory. 4 attacks across 70 days, February 22, March 24, April 13, May 3, arriving with a regularity the community had come to anticipate with something between dread and horrible clockwork certainty. Then June 28, Swinney is removed from circulation, and the attacks stop. Not after a gap, not with a final flourish, permanently. Nothing in the established pattern had suggested deceleration. He had escalated from a beating to a double murder, to another double murder, to a home invasion. And on the specific day Yule Swinney was taken off the streets, the series ended. In the architecture of circumstantial evidence, temporal coincidence of this precision carries genuine weight. Max Tackett and Tillman Johnson could not ignore it. These were the investigators who worked the Swinney case most directly, men who had examined the physical evidence, conducted the interviews, built the investigative architecture around the arrest. They were not theorists who became enamored of a suspect and reverse-engineered a case to fit their conclusion. They were experienced law enforcement professionals who had handled the material firsthand and arrived, independently and jointly, at the same conclusion. Yule Swinney was the phantom killer. That conviction did not waver in the decades that followed. It did not soften with the passage of time. Tackett and Johnson carried it for the rest of their lives, the kind of testimony that cannot be cross-examined but cannot be entirely discounted because it belongs to people who were there. But the arrest was not a conclusion. It was the beginning of a different kind of problem. What Peggy Swinney said, she said in detail. Not merely that she implicated her husband, she described things. Specific things. The white sack pulled over a man's head. The crude holes cut for the eyes. The locations along Highway 67. The gravel roads. The darkened corridors through Spring Lake Park. She told police that Yule had confessed to her, that he had described the attacks, named the places, provided the kind of operational account a man gives when he is remembering his own crimes rather than theorizing about someone else's. The particulars she offered were not the generalized imagery of a masked figure and flashlight that the Gazette had given to every reader in the region. What she described included details that had not been published, operational specifics, the kind of information that stays at a crime scene that investigators protect precisely because it separates people who know because they were there from people who know because they read the paper. Tackett and Johnson treated the convergence as significant. Without Peggy, there was no murder case. Not a weak case requiring additional corroboration, no case at all. Yule Swinney had not confessed. No witness placed him at any of the 4 attack sites. The .32 caliber pistol could not be ballistically linked to the murder scenes with the evidence available in 1946. The car established a physical connection between the Swinneys and the Griffin Moore scene, but it connected that scene to Peggy, not with legal sufficiency to Yule. She was not one thread in a larger evidentiary fabric. She was the fabric. And then she took it back. Before any charge related to the murders was formally filed, Peggy withdrew her statements in their entirety. She told investigators and prosecutors that she had fabricated her account, that the police had pressured her, coerced her, and that what she had told them was not the truth but a story produced under duress. The woman who had described the white sack and the operational details that only a witness could know now said she had made all of it up. Then Texas law applied its own finishing blow. Under the laws of Texas in 1946, a spouse could not be compelled to testify against their partner. Once Peggy recanted and invoked that protection, prosecutors had no legal mechanism to force her back to the stand. The law designed to protect the marital relationship from state coercion became, in this specific instance, the wall that stood between Yule Swinney and a murder charge. The case did not collapse because the evidence was examined and found insufficient. It evaporated because the legal structure made pursuit impossible once the sole witness exercised her right to silence. Prosecutors never filed murder charges against Swinney. Not an acquittal, not a hung jury, not a case that went to trial and failed. The charges were simply never brought, a legal non-event that left the investigative record frozen, the file open, the fundamental question unanswered. An acquittal at least represents a verdict. What happened here wasn't even that. It was a door the law would not permit anyone to open. Not every investigator who worked the case accepted the Swinney premise. Gonzalez, the man brought in specifically to solve this, who had examined the condition of the evidence most closely from a position of institutional authority, was reportedly not convinced. His summary has the quality of a man describing a structural problem rather than a moral conclusion. We had a suspect, we had a confession, and we had nothing. That is not the statement of a man frustrated by the law's failure to act on evidence he believes is strong. It is a precise description of the evidentiary state that having a suspect and having a confession is not the same as having evidence, and that evidence is what a legal system requires. Sheriff Presley similarly did not align himself with the certainty that Tackett and Johnson carried. Strong evidence tends to produce consensus among experienced professionals who have examined it. The Swinney case did not. Peggy recanted. She may have done so because her husband threatened her. Explicitly or implicitly, a woman married to a man who, if the investigators who believed in his guilt were correct, had killed 5 people with systematic calm across 10 weeks. A woman in that position, in 1946, with limited legal protection and a husband very much alive in the same system that held her, might rationally calculate that recantation was the only viable exit. That explanation has internal coherence. She may have recanted because police had, in fact, pressured her beyond acceptable boundaries. Her initial statements produced not by genuine knowledge, but by the mechanism of a frightened person in custody being told what the right answer was. Coerced testimony was not theoretical in 1946 American law enforcement. The power differential between a woman in police custody and the investigators questioning her was not negligible. That explanation also has internal coherence. She may have recanted because, having regained equilibrium, she genuinely believed the details she offered had not been as uniquely specific as investigators claimed, that she had assembled her account from newspaper coverage and ambient information that saturates a community living inside a murder investigation, and that what felt to investigators like insider knowledge was a story constructed from available pieces. Each version of Peggy is internally consistent. Each is historically plausible. None can be ruled out. The 3 versions of her, the woman who knew the truth and told it, the woman coerced into a lie, and the woman who constructed a lie of her own design and then abandoned it, are all still present in the historical record, and the record provides no instrument for distinguishing between them. That is the epistemological inheritance of this case. A single witness, 2 contradictory statements, and no mechanism for determining which one was true. The entire question of whether Yule Lee Swinney was the phantom killer lives inside the space between what Peggy said in that first interrogation room and what she said when she walked it back. The strongest version of the affirmative case begins with a calendar. 4 attacks across 70 days, spaced with almost metronomic regularity. Then June 28, Swinney arrested. The attacks stop and do not resume. In the architecture of circumstantial evidence, that coincidence refuses to be ignored. Add the physical connection to the Griffin Moore murder scene through the stolen car. Add Swinney's profile as a man who moved through the region in stolen vehicles, who knew these roads, who operated with nocturnal geographic fluency through the same corridors the Phantom used. Add Tackett and Johnson's lifelong, settled conviction. Now set it beside the problems. No weapon was ever ballistically linked to Yul Swinney. The .32 caliber pistol found on his person was the right caliber, and .32 caliber handguns were among the most common privately owned firearms in America in 1946. No eyewitness placed Swinney at any of the 4 attack sites. Not one. Mary Jean Larry, the witness with the closest encounter, told police she believed her attacker was a black man. Swinney was white. That is not a minor complication to be folded quietly into the affirmative case. It is an anomaly the affirmative case has never fully resolved. There was no confession from Swinney himself, not a partial admission, not an ambiguous statement under questioning, not a deathbed disclosure. 48 years of silence. And the career criminal argument cuts both ways. The documented behavioral profile of a property criminal does not naturally predict serial sexual predation. The distance between stealing cars and the specific violence the Phantom committed is not a small step. The epistemologically honest position, after surveying all of this, is not a comfortable one. The scale does not tip cleanly. Every fact supporting the Swinney theory belongs to the same file as every fact undermining it, and they do not resolve into a single answer. Yul Swinney walked out of prison when his sentence for car theft expired. He lived 30 more years. He died on the 15th of September, 1994, in a silence on this specific subject that had lasted nearly half a century. Whatever he knew about the spring of 1,946 inches Texarkana, whether it was the intimate knowledge of a killer or the proximity knowledge of a criminal who had simply been close enough to absorb details, he carried it. Absolutely. The silence he maintained is, in its own way, a kind of testimony. But silence is not confession. And the one person whose answer might have changed this case is 30 years gone. Mary Jeannie Larry was 19 years old when she told investigators she believed her attacker was a black man. She was careful about it. The mask had covered his face. She could not be certain, but it was her genuine impression, offered under conditions of recent physical trauma, from someone close enough to the man to feel his hands on her, to hear his voice, to understand that she was very nearly not alive to describe him at all. That statement is the foundational eyewitness description of the Phantom Killer, from the only person who ever saw him face to face and survived with enough cognitive function to report what she saw. Every subsequent theory, every suspect profile, every investigative inference traces backward through her account. Some law enforcement personnel reportedly challenged it. In the segregated South of 1946, in a law enforcement culture built on explicit racial hierarchy, a black serial killer targeting white couples was not a concept that fit easily into existing investigative frameworks. Not impossible in the abstract. In the operational imagination of Southern law enforcement in 1946, it was something close to unthinkable, not because it could not occur, but because the entire architecture of racial anxiety in the Jim Crow South was premised on a different kind of threat, one that law enforcement had very specific and very brutal tools for addressing. If Larry's identification was minimized, dismissed, or reframed as too uncertain to act on, the investigation oriented itself toward white suspects from the beginning, not because the evidence demanded that orientation, but because the institutional environment made any other direction difficult to sustain. An investigation that began by accepting her description at face value would have produced a different suspect pool. Different interviews, different alibis checked, different movements traced. Whether that different direction would have led to the phantom killer, or simply to a different set of wrong conclusions, cannot be known. What can be said is that the direction taken was shaped not by the totality of available evidence, but by a prior institutional assumption about what the evidence was allowed to mean. The inverse problem requires equal attention. A community primed by decades of racial anxiety did not receive information about a potential black attacker preying on white couples in a neutral register. In Texarkana in 1946, a town with a documented history of racial violence, where segregation was actively maintained through intimidation, and where the law functioned differently depending on which side of the color line you stood, that information had the potential to generate a different kind of investigative failure. The aggressive targeting of black men, not because evidence pointed toward them, but because panic demanded a culprit, and the social structure provided a ready category. Black residents of Texarkana in the spring of 1946 occupied a position of acute legal and physical vulnerability. Innocent men may have been investigated more aggressively, their alibis scrutinized more harshly, their accounts received with more institutional suspicion, not because the evidence connected them to the crimes, but because the social conditions made them natural targets for investigative attention. At the same time, those same men may have been less useful as witnesses precisely because the law enforcement apparatus approaching them was the same one that had historically functioned as an instrument of racial control. You do not volunteer information to a system that has consistently treated you as a threat. That dynamic, the silencing of potential witnesses by the agencies tasked with gathering information, is a documented feature of racial segregation's effect on criminal investigation. There is no reason to assume Texarkana in 1946 was an exception, so the racial dimension operates in two directions simultaneously. If Larry's identification was set aside in favor of a white suspect focus, investigators may have been looking at the wrong population from the beginning. If her identification was taken seriously enough to generate aggressive scrutiny of black residents, investigators may have terrorized innocent people while the actual killer moved freely through the other half of their potential suspect pool. Both outcomes represent investigative failure. Both trace to the same structural cause. In 2020, the FBI released over 1,100 pages of case documentation from the phantom killer investigation records accumulated across the original federal involvement, declassified more than 70 years after the murders. Researchers, journalists, and amateur investigators have worked through those files in the years since. No forensic breakthrough has emerged. What those files have not produced is a definitive accounting of how racial bias shaped the investigation's direction, whether Larry's racial identification was actively suppressed, whether black residents were subjected to disproportionate investigative pressure, whether the Bureau's involvement made the racial dynamics better or worse. The files may contain material that, read alongside the now established scholarship on FBI practices toward black communities in the 1940s, would reframe what the investigation actually did and didn't do. What can be said with confidence is that the question has not been resolved, and the resolution, if it is possible, has not yet been attempted with adequate rigor. In 1946 Texarkana, racial bias was not a failure of individual investigators to meet an otherwise equitable standard. It was the standard embedded in the legal architecture of the state, the social organization of the town, the professional training of the officers, the institutional culture of the agencies involved. Investigators who challenged Larry's account were not necessarily doing something they understood as bias. They were doing something that felt, to them, like appropriate professional skepticism that happened to align precisely and completely with the racial hierarchy of their institution and their era. That alignment between professional instinct and social prejudice is exactly how structural bias functions. It requires no villain. It produces its effects through the ordinary operation of people doing their jobs inside systems that were never designed to be neutral. The Texas Rangers were founded in 1823, before Texas was a state, before it was a republic. Stephen F. Austin organized a small company of mounted men to protect Anglo settlers along the Colorado River. And from that provisional arrangement grew one of the oldest law enforcement institutions in the Western Hemisphere. The Rangers have worked cattle wars, border conflicts, bank robberies, and assassination plots across 2 centuries of American history. In all of that time, the oldest active unsolved murder case the agency carries is a file from Texarkana, 1,946. 5 victims, 4 attacks, 10 weeks. A case that has never been formally closed because it has never been formally resolved. That is the weight of it. Not a cold case in the colloquial sense, not something that went quiet and faded. An officially active investigation maintained in the case management system, awaiting the evidentiary threshold that would allow it to be retired. A conviction, a confirmed perpetrator identification, a definitive forensic determination. None of those thresholds have been met. Captain Gonzalez died in 1977. The Texarkana case, an unfinished chapter in a career otherwise defined by its closures. Whatever knowledge he carried about the investigation's internal workings, the judgment calls made off the record, the leads followed and then set aside for reasons that may have been sound or may have been influenced by structural pressures, died with him. Tackett and Johnson, the men who believed most deeply in Swinney's guilt, have been gone for decades. Yule Swinney died on the 15th of September 1994. No deathbed statement, no letter to investigators, no confession, no denial, a silence that became permanent 30 years ago now, taking with it whatever the truth actually was. Peggy Swinney's fate is not clearly documented in the public record. Whether she outlived her husband, whether she ever addressed what she said and unsaid to investigators in 1946, whether there is anyone left who spoke with her directly about any of it, these are questions without publicly available answers. The question of DNA evidence deserves a direct answer, because it is where a contemporary audience's hope migrates when confronted with a pre-molecular cold case. The answer, as it applies to the Phantom Killer investigation, is this: no publicly confirmed physical evidence suitable for genetic genealogy testing has been identified. This is not a matter of samples awaiting processing. The crime scenes were processed in 1946 by agencies with 1946 protocols. Evidence that might have contained biological material was collected and stored under conditions not designed for the decades of preservation that forensic genealogy requires. Whether anything retrievable survives, in what condition, and in which archive, is not publicly known. The genetic genealogy method that has solved cases once considered permanently closed: the Golden State Killer, the 1,987 murders of Tanya Van Colenborg and Jay Cook, requires a starting point, a biological sample from the perpetrator. Without that, the method has nothing to work from. The Phantom Killer case, as far as the public record reflects, has not provided that starting point. There is a concept in mathematics called an asymptote, a curve that approaches a line infinitely without ever touching it. Resolution in this case functions that way. Each year of technological advancement brings new tools theoretically applicable to historical evidence. Each year of archival analysis brings new eyes to 1,100 pages of FBI documentation. And each year simultaneously eliminates living witnesses, allows physical evidence to further degrade, closes the generational distance between anyone who might still know something and the moment when that knowledge could be transmitted. The curve moves, the line does not. The Phantom Killer did not escape justice through superior intelligence or tactical sophistication. He attacked couples in parked cars on a specific stretch of highway. He used the same weapon across multiple incidents. He operated in a geographically bounded area. He moved through a mid-sized southern border city, not a vast wilderness, not an anonymous metropolis, but a community of 30,000 people where everyone knew most everyone else. By any reasonable measure, this should have been a solvable case. He escaped because the machinery around him was fractured at every load-bearing joint precisely when it needed to hold. 2 states, 4 agencies, competing egos, and withheld evidence. A spousal testimony law that turned a recantation into an impenetrable wall. A racial architecture that may have filtered the investigation's most foundational eyewitness account before anyone formally evaluated it. None of those fractures was inevitable. Each was the product of choices, institutional, political, procedural, human, made long before the first shot was fired on the 22nd of February 1946. The Phantom walked through the gaps between those choices. Every October, when the days shorten and the temperature in northeast Texas finally begins to drop, the town of Texarkana does something that has no real equivalent anywhere else in America. It gathers at Spring Lake Park, the same park where Betty Jo Booker's body was found on the morning of the 14th of April, 1946, and screens a movie about what happened to her. Not a memorial service. Not a candlelight vigil, a film screening, outdoors, in the dark, at the site of a murder that was never solved. People bring chairs and blankets. They sit where she was found, and they watch. The film is Times, the Town That Dreaded Sundown, directed by Charles B. Pierce and released in 1976, 30 years after the murders, while the case was still officially active. Pierce shot in Texarkana, at the actual locations, on the actual highway corridor where the attacks occurred, and marketed the film as a semi-documentary. Real dates, real victim counts, the real name of the town. The white flour sack mask with crude eye holes, recreated directly from Mary Larry's description of what she saw on the night of the 22nd of February 1946. For the families of the victims, the film's release was not a cultural moment. It was an assault. Survivors and relatives reportedly responded with outraged people for whom the spring of 1946 was not history but an open wound, still bleeding 30 years later. Watching a studio production dramatize the worst thing that had ever happened to them and market that dramatization as entertainment, as spectacle, as a ticket to sell on a Friday night, while the man responsible remained unidentified and alive. Pierce's film is rough and episodic, the work of a regional filmmaker on a limited budget. It does not linger on the victims as human beings. What it does, repeatedly and effectively, is film a masked figure approaching parked cars at night, a flashlight cutting through fogged glass, footsteps on gravel, and it does this in 1976, 2 years before John Carpenter's times. Halloween Times introduced Michael Myers to American cinema and launched the slasher genre into the mainstream. That timing has not received the attention it deserves. The Town That Dreaded Sundown Times is now recognized by genre historians as a proto-slasher, a direct visual precursor to the formal genre that followed. The masked killer with no spoken motive. Rural isolation, couples in parked cars, the flashlight as harbinger of violence. These images derive, in a documentable lineage, from what actually happened in Texarkana in 1946, from what Mary Larry described to investigators, from the cultural residue that description left on a community across 3 decades. Michael Myers wears a white mask. Jason Voorhees wears a hockey mask. Leatherface wears a mask made of human skin. Every one of them is a descendant, aesthetically and conceptually, of a white flour sack pulled over a man's head on a gravel road in Bowie County, Texas. The genealogy is not metaphorical. The Phantom's disguise entered American horror's bloodstream before the slasher genre existed to receive it. And when the genre finally took shape in the late 1970s, that image was already there, waiting. The Phantom was real before the genre had a name for him. In 2014, A second film bearing the same title was released, a meta-sequel depicting a copycat killer in contemporary Texarkana, using the 1976 Pierce film as a literal blueprint for violence. By then, the story had completed 2 full cycles of adaptation. Real murders produced a film, the film produced a mythology, and the mythology produced another film built around the mythology. Each layer further insulated the original victims from the cultural product that carries their names. Each adaptation adding fictional distance between Betty Jo Booker as a 15-year-old girl and Betty Jo Booker as an Hastings element in a horror franchise's narrative architecture. That is what happens to victims when cases go unsolved and time converts them to legend. The girl disappears into the story. The story detaches from the girl. What remains is an image, the masked figure, the gravel road, the flashlight, while the specific human being who had a chair in a working band, who earned A's at Texarkana High School, who played alto saxophone on Easter Saturday 1946, and was found in the woods the following morning, becomes harder and harder to see through the accumulated layers of myth. The phrase "times the town that dreaded sundown times" did not start as a film title. It started as a description the way Texarkana had already begun to narrate its own trauma back to itself over the preceding 30 years. That identity was not chosen. It was imposed by 10 weeks in 1946 and reinforced by every retelling since. The annual screening at Spring Lake Park is a real attempt to process something that was never processed through legitimate channels. The case was never tried. There was no verdict. There was no official moment of communal reckoning at which the town could be told, "Here is what happened. Here is who did it. Here is the account rendered." That moment never came. In the absence of judicial reckoning, a community left without a verdict improvised its own ceremony, a gathering at the site, a ritual of collective remembrance that gives the story a shape, even if it cannot give it a resolution. The film is not the same as justice, but the screening exists, partly because justice was never delivered. Every Halloween, somewhere in a lawn chair in Spring Lake Park, there is almost certainly someone who came for the movie and knows the Phantom Killer the way most people know him now, as an iconography, a mask, a genre archetype. Someone for whom Betty Jo Booker is, at best, a name mentioned in the opening narration before the horror begins. That is what happens when 8 decades pass without a verdict. The girl disappears into the story. Somewhere in a Texas Rangers archive, the Phantom Killer case sits today, still officially active, the oldest open murder investigation the agency carries. The institution that opened it has outlasted the Texas Republic, the Confederacy, the Second World War, the invention of molecular biology, and the digital transformation of American law enforcement. The file has outlasted everyone who created it, everyone who worked it, and nearly everyone who lived through the events it documents. A file waiting for a conclusion that the evidence, the law, the passage of time, and the accumulated weight of institutional failure have made almost mathematically impossible to deliver. Not closed, not forgotten. Just permanently, quietly open a procedural fact in a drawer, carrying the names of 5 people who deserved better from the system that was supposed to answer for them. The alto saxophone was recovered from the Marsh. The case was not. And somewhere between those 2 facts, between the brass instrument lying in the water and the file that will never reach the threshold required to close it, sits the entirety of what this story cost and what it continues to cost, and what it means that a 15-year-old girl who played music on Easter Saturday is still, 80 years later, waiting on a verdict that isn't coming.